Shalom and welcome to another edition of Parsha Talk. I'm Rabbi Elliot Malamet in Highland Park, New Jersey, at the Highland Park Conservative Temple Congregation on Shemet. And joining me, my good friends, Rabbi Jeremy Kalmanovsky on Sheikh Chesed in New York City, Rabbi Barry Chesler now he's in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, but he usually is in the Solomon Schechter Day School of Long Island, Lancaster, Pennsylvania. Give us just the lay of the land. What's going on out there?
Well, I have to say it's a beautiful part of the country. A lot of farmland. Today, Carol Galit and I went to the Amish farm and community for a tour, which is fascinating in part because there are a lot of Hasidim and from Jews who come during Chol HaMoed to this part of the world because I imagine it's relatively cheap. There are things to do for all ages. So the tour guide in the house was making a connection between the Frum Jews and the Amish and Mennonites and all the similarities that they have. So it's good to remember that we're not the only people in the world and not the only people that have wide ranges of behavior that characterize us as adherents of a religion.
It's fascinating. Last year I was out to visit you guys and had a nice ride on the Susquehanna. It was beautiful. Such a beautiful area of the country. Beautiful Pennsylvania. Hope to get there again. And how are things in New York City?
How are things in New York City? Festive. It's Pesach.
Okay. We're recording this on the eve of the last days of Pesach. In the diaspora, we observe 2 days, still, I guess, 7th and 8th day of Pesach. This puts us in a kind of a different frame. I think, it's been a joyous holiday for all of us. Of course, in Israel, it's been quite complicated. The political situation within Israel is complicated. We've spoken about that in the past. And of course, there have been a number of acts of terror, and we are on a day that is noting the passing of the third victim of the most recent terror, the mother Lucy D, and her 2 daughters Maya and Rina. And so we're in a moment where we are experiencing that grief, the destruction of a family. We're also in a moment where we are thinking about the culmination of Pesach, and that takes us in our synagogue life to, the commemorations that we find on that last day, as we do on every last day of holiday, which is Yizkor, and thinking about how to wrap our minds around that and what Yizkor means. And I'll just start this off with the sense that the Yizkor on Passover, as well as the Yizkor on Shmini Atzeret, these are milestone markers of the year. Shmini Atzeret comes at the beginning of the year. The 8th day of Passover, we're already, well into the year. It's 6 months now. We're at the half point of the year. We're in the 7th month of the year. So, at both of these poles of the year, we're reflecting. We also have a Yizkor at Shavuot. I find the Yizkor at Shavuot not as intense as both the Shmini Atzeret Yizkor and the Passover Yizkor, and of course the Yizkor on Yom Kippur. But each one of these Yizkors does have a certain sense of has a set of themes with it. And look, here Passover, beginning of spring, it's the sense that the festive time of the year is when we are longing for the people that are part of our lives that are not here in our lives. And that's always seems to be present. I always make this point that when we start the Seder, you look around at your table, and we are blessed with all of our loved ones. Now, of course, the last couple of years have been just awful in terms of family commemoration. And especially for those families who've lost loved ones during this time, it's been doubly, compounded by this. But the Passover Seder table is a time when you, as a family, take note of who's here and who's not here. And it can be a very, very painful time. And that's what I think. I think though that start of the festival kind of works its way through all the way to the end and needs expression by the time we get to the end of the festival. So we start with noting the absence, and that works its way through. And then by the end of the 8 days for us, that has to come to an expression. And that's what Yizkor means to me sometimes. And of course, we always have to focus on different themes for Yizkor. But as we start this off, I'm thinking, yeah, that's what's happening for me. I don't know, Jeremy, if you have any reflections on.
Very, very moving. I mean, unlike the two of you, I have two living parents, and I have each of you has also lost siblings, and I happen. So I'm personally in a different spot than the two of you are in the sort of arc of my own life. That said, what you said is extremely resonant with me, because Passover and the fall holidays in their way, Shmini Atzeret is something of the orphaned holiday, but the holidays, the memories are all going to be around the people that you shared them with. And so when people are absent, it's just got a very, the absence can be its own kind of presence in a really big way. And so I think Yizkor is very expressive of exactly that.
Very.
So, as is my wont, I would say two things. The first one has to do with the idea that our Shalosh Regalim, but Pesach more than the other two, is a holiday that is intensely about national memory. It is, we remember that we were slaves in Egypt, but the truth of the matter is we were not slaves in Egypt. And even though we may eat assorted foods that suggest the experience, thank God most of us have never experienced anything like it. But Yizkor, on the other hand, is about personal memory. We're not thinking so much about the people that we've lost historically. We're thinking about our own friends and family, and especially at Pesach, and to a lesser degree at Sukkot, but also because of the image of the Sukkah and the table in the Sukkah, we're thinking about people around the around the table. And there seems to be a need that for our personal reflection to be part of our national story. That Yizkor is part of making the national story our own story. And our national story is one of loss as well as hope. And we have to remember that. The other thing that I just say one other thing, which I think is important, is that we call it Yizkor, which is he will remember, but we often forget that we're asking God to remember. That what Yizkor is about is finding eternity in God, the eternal, who is to remember for eternity our loss, because we are not going to live forever. And we all know in one way or the other that one day someone is going to say Yizkor for us as well. And what unites all the Yizkor experiences is we have this belief in a God who will remember for eternity.
Certainly hope people will say Yizkor for us. Before we started recording, we talked about one other aspect of this time, and we talk about Pesach is a story with heroes and villains, right? And the Egyptians are the villains, and famously, and we're the heroes, of course, and God's the hero, and famously, we also have a midrashic tradition of anxiety at the suffering of the Egyptians. Like, the Egyptians are drowning in the sea, and God, at least in some versions, the version of this midrash that appears in the Babylonian Talmud, God says to the angels, not to the human beings. The human beings can rejoice when their enemies fall, but angels shouldn't. And it's a way we have as of a midrashic teaching of awakening in ourselves human empathy, even for the people who are the most problematic, even the people who are enslaving, the enslaving Egyptians. And so, the Egyptians, when the plague of the firstborn happens, they're all wailing, and it says, Ein bait asher ein sham met. There was no house in which there was not a death. There was a dead person. And that is a really poetic and powerful human story. There's in every house, in every family, there's always loss. And so I feel like the Yizkor part, one of the things that it could do poetically is awaken us that awareness that we look around. We're celebrating, and there's no house that doesn't also have loss. And so each of them come together, yin and yang, in the fullness of the human experience.
It's, I just want to pick up again what Barry said and kind of meld it with what you said just now, Jeremy, which is that the personal family dimension and the national dimension, and both of those are quite resonant in Passover. We've talked a lot in the past about the Seder as a private family event, and of course it's telling the national story, but it's hard not to imagine that as you sit down, and at your table, you're also telling your family story. And part of what we do all the time at the Seder is think about Passovers in the past and remember Passovers in the past. And of course we're telling the national story, but we're telling it very much in the private, personal vein of our own kind of unique micro culture of a family. Similarly, on top of what Jeremy just said, there's a national dimension to this particular zone of the year. Look, we're finishing off Pesach, and right after Pesach, not even 5 days after Pesach, we're going to have Yom HaShoah. In Israel, the Yom HaShoah begins a 10-day period that has now been called Aseret Yemei Hoda'ah. It starts with Yom HaShoah, ends with Yom HaZikaron and Yom HaAtzmaut, and these are like the high holidays of Israel now. They're moments of intense national narrative, both mourning and also celebration, and locating the individual within that new modern Jewish history arc. And I can't think that also of the last day of Pesach without thinking something that by this time next week we are going to be deeply immersed in Holocaust remembrance. Our synagogues commemorate that with the Yellow Candle Project and other kinds of commemorations. We have various ceremonies. I know, Jeremy, in New York, you have the annual reading of names, a vigil. All of your synagogues basically have a collective reading. And you want to talk about that for a second?
And it rotates among synagogues, and this year it'll actually be in our synagogue, which is great, because what happens is they start at 10 p.m. and each synagogue has a half an hour slot, and the host gets the first half an hour slot at 10:30, which is great, because when you have the 3:30 or 4 o'clock slot, man, it is just awful. Yeah. It's just the worst, because you want to go and you feel like you should go, but it is really hard to go. So this year we're good. We're starting at 10, and our slot will be 10:30, and you have this sheet of names that the U.S. Holocaust Memorial in D.C. gives you, and sometimes they're different places. There'll be people from Holland, or there'll be people from Greece, or there'll be people from this or that place in Poland, and it is just so unbelievable. You get these names, and they're it's like Moshe Bornstein, Tzipora Bornstein, Yehuda Bornstein, Yitzchak Bornstein. You read the whole family, and it'll tell you the ages of each of the people, and you can just see how the family was all wiped away. And you read it all night long, and then in the morning, like at 7 o'clock or whatever, they move it from whatever synagogue it was to the JCC, where they continue on for the rest of the day, and the whole thing amounts to maybe read, and it's like 10,000 names or something like that. And
not even a rounding error.
Not even a rounding error, and just it drives home the power, the reality that 6 million is a great big number, but it's one by one by one by one by one by one by one. And I try to, when I'm reading, I try to sort of make up little stories in my head, or try to summon So like whatever, I get the name. It's Moshe Bornstein. He's 8 years old, and I try to sum up, or it's Tzipora Bornstein, and she's a 62-year-old grandmother, whatever. And you just try to imagine one by one by one by one by one person, and the enormity. It really is a tremendously powerful illustration of just the incalculable
Yes.
human misery.
I was going to say, from time to time, I get asked to proof a plaque, a memorial plaque, or a stone, and it'll have a Yiddish name on it, and Yiddish names are very difficult to spell sometimes. So I've discovered that a great resource is the Yad Vashem database, because every name is there, every spelling of every kind of spelling of every name. So I'll look up a name, and I'll look up how it's spelled, and then of course, it's hard not to just to go and to look at the testimony. At the Yad Vashem database, there's a page of testimony, and it will tell you where and when the person was killed, where they lived, etc. There's sometimes a picture of the person, and like all of us, we can get drawn into the story. And I would say for people watching and people listening to us, that if they wanted to find a way to have a meaningful commemoration on Yom HaShoah, indeed, to attend the ceremony, and it's going to become more and more important for a next generation and the next generation to find their own media for commemoration. But stop a moment, look at a testimony, just even Google something. I do this randomly from time to time when I need to kind of get grounded. I try and remember someone, and I from time to time I'll look up someone I knew who was a survivor and telling their testimony, or if you hear of someone who passed away, and I'll look up their testimony and look up their video, and I want, in a way, to say, and here is the message really. To have that bound in the bond of life. We are the living, and we are connecting the dead to the living. Let there be no breach between the dead and the living. Elie Wiesel used to say that all the time, and in a way that was very hard to understand. That there's a breach, that in our era there's been a great breach between the living and the dead. I never really understood that until I tried to think. What does it mean? It means they live with us in memory, of course, and they're part of our lives. And telling their stories, going to the testimonies, looking at the documentaries, it can be very, very hard. It's very, very depressing. It's sad, but it's part of our lives, and we have our responsibility. So, in a way, when you said, Barry, Yizkor is God. Remember, it's Israelis and us who do the commemorations for the Holocaust. We say Nizkor, we shall remember. It's our obligation to remember, and so the Yizkor service at the end of Pesach is also the Nizkor service, and leads into the Nizkor for Yom HaShoah and the Nizkor for Yom HaZikaron as well, and that ought to be part of the shaping of our ideas at this time. Reaction. We're recording this on a week for the end of Pesach, and of course we're joyful during this time, remembering also, but we're looking at next week's Parsha as well, Parashat Shmini. So we don't want to be too depressed in our Parsha show today.
Oh, we can't be too depressed. So let's just talk about the untimely, shocking death of Parashat Shmini.
Yes, the poor children of Aharon, Nadav and Avihu, who I mean, that's the main focal point of Parashat Shmini, that they bring a strange fire, and they get zapped for that, and very, very difficult to understand this. We've tried in the past to examine this story as well. They broke the rule. You don't break the rule in the sacred precincts. It's like going into the nuclear core with the wrong kind of equipment, and the ethics of it is irrelevant, whether they deserve it or not. It's a great, terrible human tragedy. And we stop at the reaction, of course. The story is told in chapter 10 of the book of Vayikra. Vatetze esh min lifnei Adonai. A fire comes out from God. Vatochalotam. So the powerful fire of God consumes them. Vayamutu lifnei Adonai, and they die. They are incinerated. Vayomer Moshe el Aaron, and Moses says to Aaron, "Hu asher diber Adonai lemor." This is what God said. Bikrovai kadesh. I need to be sanctified in the sacred area. Valpnei kol ha'am ekabed, and I need to be honored in this. Vayidam Aaron, and Aaron is silent. And of course, Moses is concerned about the fact that the ritual was just defiled. This is the ritual of consecrating the sanctuary. And of course, a terrible, terrible, tragic event happens. And Moses is so focused on having this happen properly. And he rails against Aaron for this. Vayidom Aaron, Aaron is silent. And Vayidom Aaron becomes a kind of iconic phrase for all of us to say, how do you react and respond in the face of horrible tragedy? And I'm wondering if you could pick up on any of that. I'll turn to you, Barry, because
Thank you.
so
I
We'll go silent now.
I would begin with Ramban's comment, who understands by Yidom Aharon that Aaron became silent. That, in other words, his initial reaction was an outpouring of great grief, losing not one but two sons, the two older of the four sons. And finally, he settles down and is able to become silent. Some of the rabbis suggest that Aaron is acquiescent, that he accepts the divine fate. And I think that is a little bit troubling and perhaps even glib, because there's really not enough here to be so sure that Aaron's response is one of acquiescence. We've all been in the presence of the dead and the presence of mourners, and often the initial reaction is one of shock, and the grief often comes later, and it's not acquiescence. I'm reminded that when we do the rending of the garment or the ribbon, and we say the phrase Baruch Dayan Ha'emet, we praise God as the true judge. I remember thinking many years ago that the reason why we have the mourners say that, even though very few mourners I know, nor necessarily me when I was in the position of a mourner, actually believe it at that time, but you have to say it then so that you'll actually be able to mean it sometime later in your life. That if you can't give voice to it at the worst or lowest moment of your life, then you might never be able to say it again. And we kind of force the mourner to say that, and they have to say it in order to give them something to hold on to for a later time.
Go ahead.
One last thought that occurred to me while you were talking is that, I think when we talked about Kitisa and the golden calf, Jeremy suggested that the deaths of Nadav and Avihu were in some way a punishment for the golden calf. And I have a dim recollection of talking about whether or not the golden calf was a necessary episode. Was there something about the Israelite people that caused them to sin greatly at their greatest moment? And, one of the things that struck me when I was looking over the Parsha prior to our conversation is that we often isolate the story of Nadav and Avihu as if it's the beginning of the chapter. It is the beginning of chapter 10, but actually is the culmination of the consecration service, right? Everything is going along very well. All the sacrifices are made. People are being atoned for. The priest is for the people are atoning for themselves. And then suddenly there's a great catastrophe. And it makes one wonder if this also may be something that is a necessary part of our human experience, that we really cannot configure our lives without deep tragedy marring it in some way.
We're all going to be affected by that, and by loss and by suffering and even by tragedy. God forbid. Can I want to just go back to what a thing that you said, because it kind of lit a light for me, which is that you're saying that the Baruch Dayan Emet, which is the prayer of acceptance, basically. I accept the divine decree. And the person who says it at the point, may not necessarily understand what they're saying. And if they do understand, they may not necessarily be in the moment of acceptance. But what you're saying is that they're saying that blessing for the possibility that that moment may in fact come. I think that's
Yeah.
something that
And I make them say it in both Hebrew and English so that they can understand at least the words at the time
I'm
they're
gonna
saying it.
that's something that that I think is going to mean a lot. It means a lot to hear that, and I think it's going to mean a lot to a lot of people.
It's intense. It calls to mind, by the way, the end of the book of Job, or near the end, where Job. We say this crazy thing about has the patience of Job. Job has no patience. Job at the beginning of the book, says, I'm going to hang in there. And then that lasts literally 2 chapters. And then the 38, 39, 40 chapters in the book, he's angry. He's angry at the unjust suffering. And he will not relent and say that I guess I must have deserved. His friends, his 3, friends, comforter, they come and say, well, you probably did something to deserve this. And the justice of the world will be borne out that bad people get punished. You must have done something. And he says no. And then ultimately God shows up and says, in a storm wind, shows up and says, like, do you tell the dawn to rise? Did you teach the eagle to fly? Did where were you when I set the constellations in the sky? Are you in control of the storehouse of the snow and the rain? You are immortal, and this storm wind is just far beyond you. And no, there are things that happen that you cannot understand, cosmic things that happen that you cannot understand. And I think that the tone, I would say, I would tilt towards the Aaron tone as being something more like that. When Job finally hears that from God out of the whirlwind, says, I hereby fall silent. I spoke what I was beyond me, and I will just stand next to the whirlwind and be silent. And I think that that's not going to be satisfying for everybody. People who want theodicy, who want an explanation for why there is unjust suffering, it's not. But it does, I think, teach you how to. It's not an explanation, but I think it teaches you how to respond, or potentially teaches you how to respond to what you cannot understand. And I am inclined to think that that's where Aharon goes. That he does go to some place of. And because this is taken as the story is an illustration of mystery, the Midrash has developed a series of explanations about the wrong things that Nadav and Avihu did, but actually some of the Midrash is actually kind of positive towards them, or at least ambivalent, and doesn't think that they were ill-intentioned. One wonderful phrase in the Midrash is "Ba'u lahosif ahava al ahava." They wanted to just add more love to love. They were just caught up in the enthusiasm, and maybe you're not allowed to do that, but it's because they got so close. They weren't being punished. They just got too close to the fire, and God zapped because of the maybe ecstatic nature of the spirituality or something like that. And so because the story is mysterious, I'm inclined to read Aaron's response as relating to the mystery as well, and the silence as relating to the mystery.
I just want to come back to Job for a second. And I think that at the very end, what Job gets is the visitation, the presence of God. So he could put aside the need for an explanation because he understands that God is there for him. Would that our mourners and those of us who are mourning would sense God's presence? That would obviate in some way the need for an explanation. But I think in our world today, very few of us, much of the time, feel that sense of God's presence so powerfully that we could say that a rational explanation is now unnecessary.
Yeah, I'm going to amplify what you said. I remember hearing this Rabbi Harlan Wexler. He taught this passage and says, there's nothing really new in what God says to Job. It's the fact that God shows up, and that has made a real strong impression on people reading the text, that there's a relational component to this, and that by God showing up means that it doesn't that I am with you. At least I am with you in this moment. And here, allow me to be just a little critical of Moses, in that when Moses is so focused on the ritual and not focused on his brother's tragedy, he really is not there for Aaron. And the relationship is dented by this, is damaged by this. We have the luxury of being a little critical of Moses here, and saying that there is some zeal here in the performance of the ritual according to its writ, but there is a human dimension to all ritual. There's a human dimension to the people who function, and this is a moment of profound loss where something else needed to be there. And the Vayidom Aharon, the Aaron was silent, is often taken as this is how we need to respond to the great unanswerable questions of suffering in life. And I'm not really sure that I would go in that vein. I would say, we obviously have no answers, but sometimes silence, to say I'm not going to say anything, silence is not what it's called for. It's your body, your presence of your arm.
Presence is what it's
the
called.
presence.
Right.
And sometimes your presence is just in the nonverbal way that a person speaks with their body, in an embrace, and often it's just I need to cry with you, I need to be with you, I need to share that emotional space with you in a way that can't be evoked and can't be articulated. We can certainly do our best to articulate the inarticulatable when we're removed from it, but when we're in it, we need to be in it, and that's what this is about.
That's the old joke, or not joke, but clever saying about pastoral counseling. Don't just say something, sit there. And I think that's true. But I want to agree with you about the Torah's critical assessment of Moshe's reaction, but I want to put a very slightly different direction than you, very slightly different asterisk on it, which is that you pointed out that Moshe is very focused on the ritual and doesn't appreciate Aaron. Aaron actually teaches Moshe something about the ritual, because the chatat offering, chatat works, the purification offering works when the Kohanim eat the animal. That's somehow part, whatever that seems to us now, that's somehow part of the ritual magic. And Moshe, chapter 10, verse 16, Ve'et seir chatat, darash Moshe. Moses wanted to find out what happened to the goat of the purification offering. V'hine saraf, it got burned up and not eaten. Veitzof, and Moses gets angry. Al Elazar ve'al Itamar b'nei Aharon hanotarim, and Moses gets angry at Itamar and Elazar, the surviving brothers, and he says to them, "Why didn't you eat the sin offering in the holy place? Because that's what you're supposed to do. Madua lo achaltem et hachatat bimkom hakadosh ki kodesh kodashim. This is this very sacred item, sacred food. You're supposed to eat it. V'ata natan lachem laseit et avon ha'edah. You were supposed to eat it to alleviate the sin of the community, lechaper alehem, to atone for them, lifnei Adonai. And now lo huva damo hen lo huva dama el hakodesh, and the blood was not brought inside el hakodesh panima. Achol tochlota bakodesh kasher tziviti. Kasher tziveti. You should have eaten this like I told you. And then Aaron says to him, very vividly, everything has happened to me. Hen hayom hikrivu et chatatam ve'et olatam lifnei Adonai v'tikrena oti ka'ele. They brought the sin offering. They did what they were supposed to do. And then what happened. Ve'achalti chatat hayom hayitav be'nei Adonai. And if I had gone ahead, or my sons had gone ahead and eaten the offering, would that have been satisfying in the eyes of God? Vayishma Moshe, and Moses understands that. Vayitav be'enav, and he accepts it. That's right. Aaron is saying, not only is Moshe focused on the ritual as opposed to the human, Moshe is saying it doesn't matter about the human. The ritual must be done in its precision. And Aaron is saying, let me teach you something about the nature of ritual. Ritual is not the action. Ritual is the person doing the action. And it would not have been pleasing to God if a person in mourning had eaten this, because the emotion, the spiritual part, the feeling part, the kavanah part, just wouldn't have been there. Like, later on in Deuteronomy, which is another another setting altogether, when you bring the vidui maaser, the person brings all of their tithes and says, lo achalti mimenu be'oni, I didn't eat it while in mourning. It seems to me like the same thing is going on here. Moses doesn't seem to know that mourners cannot take part in rituals. And Aaron has to tell him, it's not just that you're thinking about the wrong thing, it's that you don't even know what you're talking about, because mourners don't have the heart to engage in the spiritual part of this. And Moses says, actually, you're right.
It's worth highlighting a great irony in the way that you present this, because we often identify the priest as the person concerned primarily with ritual, and the prophet concerned primarily with people. And here is the way you explain it so beautifully, Jeremy. Aaron is concerned with the people, and Moses, the prophet, is concerned with the ritual, and that balance cannot stand. But I want to add one other thing, if I might, that in the book of Numbers, in the episode of the rock, where Moses and Aaron misspeak to the rock, shall we say, Moses is taken to task there for mourning too much for his sister Miriam and neglecting the people. So Moses, often can't win no matter what he does. When he's concerned with the people, he should have been concerned with the ritual. When he's concerned with the ritual, he should have been concerned with the people. What do you want from him?
What can you do? Well, we are concerned with the ritual of how we're going to conclude our Parsha talk, but also to say to people, have a wonderful, wonderful end of the Yontiv, 7th and 8th day, beautiful 7th day, the splitting of the sea, and lots of things to talk about there. But we didn't do that. Instead, we focused on the more uplifting part, Yizkor, national memory, and the death of Nadav and Avihu coming
And
up.
Yom HaShoah. We just sprinkled in a little Yom HaShoah for the good of it.
And that's why you can always count on us to be uplifting and to give you meaning. We want to wish you a beautiful Yontiv, end of Yontiv. Hope it was a beautiful, beautiful holiday and a good Shabbos. And we will see you next week on the next edition of Parsha Talk. Shabbat Shalom, good Yontiv.
Shabbat Shalom, Chag Sameach.
Shabbat Shalom, Chag Sameach.